before we get started here is, you'll notice I don't have a project open right now. Alright, and that's because we're going to go and start directly in the family editor. Alright, if you remember when we went and edited the title block, right, as we went and opened it up and we opened the family file up and it brought us into the family editor, right? So that's kind of different from the actual projects that we start and build within Revit, alright? And so just a quick point to make before we get into these families here. So I think I might have mentioned it before when we first started the course, but so within Revit, right, families kind of make up everything we do, right? Whether it's annotations, whether it's physical objects we're putting in our model, right? But within those families, Revit kind of breaks them down into kind of three overarching groups of families, all right, or different kinds of families, all right, which are system families, loadable families, and in-place families. All right. Now, system families we've already had some experience with, right? System families are going to be the families that you kind of create in your projects, and more or less are going to be the ones that have layers to them, right? So like your walls, your floors, your roofs, all right? Those families that are created inside your projects, okay, those are considered system families. Now, generally speaking, if you look at what kind of elements to the building are system families, is they're generally going to be the elements of your building that make up anything that is built on site for a building, right? So if you think of the floors or the walls, generally speaking, as you build those on the job site, right, they're generally not prefabbed off-site, although now they do have options to prefab those things. But generally speaking, those are the objects and elements of your building that get built on the job site. All right. The second type, the loadable families, right? Those are the families we've dealt with. The doors, the windows. All right. The families that we have to load in as a separate file. All right. We go in, we do load family, find the file, and load it into our projects. Right. So those kind of are their own separate families. All right. Their own separate files. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. All right, with our window family. Okay, but just keep in mind that those ones do kind of reside outside of your project, and there are separate files. All right. Generally speaking, the elements of a building that are loadable files or loadable families are your doors, your windows. All right, things that are generally manufactured off the job site and are shipped and bought and kind of brought and installed on the job site. So anything, your furniture, your fixtures, lights, doors, windows, things like that. All right. So generally, those get basically purchased and shipped to the job site. All right. And the third type of family that we're not going to go and touch on really, but is important to know, are called the in-place families. So if you have a family, let's say that a custom cabinetry or a custom millwork piece, all right, and really it's very custom to this exact project that you're working on. All right, you have the option of building it in place, and what it does is allows you to create a new family. All right, build it in place in your project instead of opening up the family editor. All right, and you can build it in place so that way you can use the walls and the shape of your whole project to build it. Now, the upside to it is if it's a very custom piece and it has to fit exactly into a space, all right, you can use it and build it right there in place. The downside to it is that you can no longer use that family anywhere else in any other project. All right, you can use it multiple times within that same project, but you can't save it as a separate file and use it into another project. All right, so the in-place families live inside the single project. Okay, so if it is something that you're going to want to use from project to project, is you're not going to want to do it in place. You're going to want to do it as a loadable family, so that way you can take it from project to project. All right. Okay, so to start out here, all right, again, like I said, we're not going to start in a project. If we go down to the families here, I'm going to go ahead and select new. All right. Now, what's important with when you're starting a new family is to select the right template file here, and that's just because depending on what you're making for a family, it'll start you out with the correct settings. So in our case, where we're doing a window, all right, it's important because a window is a hosted element and it has the wall there. All right, and Revit will automatically have a wall with the hole cut out for you and everything like that. All right, so you don't have to worry about trying to host your element itself. Okay, so it's important to select the correct template file. Right now, there is a generic template file. All right, you can see generic model and all of these different types of generic files or templates to work off of. All right, that you can use if the family you're creating doesn't fall into any of the categories. All right, but generally speaking, is there should be a category here or a template that will fit your needs of what you're building. All right, and so we're just going to do the typical window. All right, not the window with trim, just the regular window at the very bottom here. And we're going to go ahead and open. All right, and so that's going to open us up and bring us into the family editor with the window family template. Alright, so now that we have it open, alright, you'll notice that, again, if you recognize the family editor a bit from when we opened up the title block, right, in the last class, is your tabs are a little bit different here. Alright, if you look at the floor plan, you can see this is what we're looking at in the floor plan here. Alright, and again, by using the window family template, alright, it already gives us some of the basic kind of settings and basic parameters that we need. Right, so you can see we have a width one already created here. It already has labeled for us the interior and exterior sides of your window. All right, and it also has some dimensions already set up for us. So you can see that these dashed lines here, all right, which are reference planes, which we'll get into in a minute. These are already spaced out with the equality symbol to make sure that everything kind of sits nicely within itself. All right. Okay, so now that we're in our floor plan here, all right, there's a couple things that you're going to want to do kind of beforehand, all right, before you start to model in geometry. So it's very similar to a project. All right, you're going to want to try and do as much setup as you can, all right, and kind of do all of your settings out, you know, either beforehand or kind of as you go along, so that way you don't have to go back after the fact. All right. Okay. And so one of the things that we're going to want to set up, all right, and you'll see here that you have this value is width, right? And you've probably noticed when you're loading in either windows or doors, right, depending on which family you load in, some of them have more options in the parameters and in the properties box that you can change around, right? Some of the windows or doors, some of them might have an option where you can go and change the size of trim, things like that, all right, instead of just having width and height. Okay, and that's all kind of determined beforehand based on whoever has created that family. All right, so if you think of ahead of time, you know, what am I going to want to control here? All right, you know, am I going to want to just have the basic control, whether, you know, width and height? Am I going to want to control, you know, the size of the frame, the, you know, the thickness of all the pieces in it, things like that? All right, and having that idea ahead of time, you know, and trying to set it up ahead of time, really comes into play, you know, as you're building out this family. That way, you know what you have to build for. And it kind of just saves you a little bit of a headache to try and have to do it, you know, down the road. All right. So, based on that fact, all right, is we're going to kind of go in and, you know, build out some of these parameters, all right, as we go along. All right. And you've probably heard me, you know, throughout the class talk about parameters and properties, right? So the parameters are each one of these values that are in your properties box, right? And basically, the fact that, you know, these loadable families have these parameters to them, right, makes kind of Revit the way that it is, right? Is Revit and the Revit families are called parametric families, right? Because they're driven based on these parameters that are in the properties box. Okay, and basically what we're going to want to do as we build out our families, right, is basically create and define all these different types of parameters. So that way, when you do load it into your family, or you do load it into your project rather, right, is you have, you know, a number of different options that you can use so that you can modify it there in the project, as opposed to having to open the whole family up and kind of modify it there afterwards. All right. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, if you go up into either your Create tab or any of these tabs, all right, if we go under the Create tab, and all the way over here on the left where you see Properties, all right, right here it'll say Family Types, and we're going to click that. And this will bring us up the Family Types dialog box. Right? Now, it should look similar to what you're used to seeing if you open up the type properties, right? But you notice you have a whole bunch of different options on the right here, right? And that's basically because this is where we go and we create all of our different types, All right, we create all of our parameters that we're going to want to use. Okay. So, for instance, if we look here under dimensions, we have height and width. All right, so it's pretty typical window family, right? Is you're always going to have the height and the width. Okay. Wall closure, construction type, right? So these are kind of the default settings here. Okay. We'll notice at the top as well, where we're used to seeing the type selector, right? So you're able to drop this down and select all the different types, right? You'll notice that it doesn't have anything here, all right? And that's because we haven't created anything yet. So if you remember when we open up either a family that has doors or a family with windows, right? We always duplicate the type and then change the settings. All right, is what you can do here is create new family types. Right, so you can create a number of different family types, right? Whether they're different sizes, whatever. Okay, and you can do that kind of ahead of time so that your family by default will load in with these certain types. All right. Now you don't have to create multiple types. You can create just one and then load it into your project. And as you kind of go through your project, you can create all your different types for yourself. All right, but we're going to create at least one here. Okay. And we're going to click on New under Family Types. And we're going to go with just what this is showing here by default, so a 3x4 window. Alright. So we're going to name it 3 foot by 4 foot. Okay. So that's the window size that we're going to create. I'm going to hit OK. You'll notice now at the top, you see 3x4. Okay. Now if you go ahead and click New and keep creating different types, right, you'll be able to drop this selector down, right, and then change the settings, right, based on that family type, right, just like you would in a regular project. Okay, but again, this is where, we kind of define and change all the different parameters that are involved with these family types. Okay. All right. So go ahead and hit OK for now. All right. And let's kind of get oriented with our views here. So we're in our plan view, right, which is reference level. Right, you'll notice that we have this wall, right, which is pretty basic, just a generic 6-inch wall, right? You don't need to play around with this. Okay. You'll notice that you have some reference planes here, all right? You'll have some dimensions, and it's already labeled interior and exterior for yourself. Okay. Now, if you open up, let's say, for example, a 3D view, all right? You scroll out here. All right, find myself. You'll notice that all you really have is a wall and you have a hole cut into it. Alright? And by default with the window template, Revit automatically does that for you. Alright? And it's already kind of made itself so that however large or small you make this opening, alright, or change your parameters around, it'll make the opening the same size. Alright? And also because it has the wall here and has the opening in it, right, Revit automatically has this set up as a hosted element, so you won't have to worry about hosting this to anything, all right, and have to go through that whole hassle. All right, so the window will automatically be hosted, so that way it'll automatically go, put itself into a wall, and cut itself out when you place it into your project. All right. But you can also see if we go to your elevations here, let's say exterior. All right. Zoom fit. All right. We also have, move these for a second, that way we can see where we're at here. Alright. We also have some other reference planes and some default dimensions. Okay, so you can see this height 4 feet here, this dimension line. Alright, so every time you have a dimension line that has kind of a title like this, or in Revit's case it's called a label. Alright, and we'll go through how to create labels in a minute. Alright, you'll be able to know that, when it has a label like this in the dimension, basically that means this dimension line, so the space between these two lines here, is driven by one of the parameters, alright, in your properties. Alright, so that, the default sill height, things of that nature. So if we go in here and you can see the height, the width, alright, default sill height here. So if you were to change this around, for example, alright, so instead of height 4 feet, I change this to 5 feet, alright, and reply, right, you'll see how that changes, okay? And that same logic is basically going to be what we use when we go and create new parameters, alright, we create a new properties and such for our window, okay? And so to get started here, all right, we're going to keep very simple, all right? So we're basically going to do just a basic frame, okay, for the window. We're going to put, a basic sash in, and then, just a single plate of glass, all right? But we'll go through and replace all those elements, and we'll make a couple of different parameters and kind of create some different options for ourselves, all right, in a couple different ways here with our family, okay? Okay. And so I am going to go ahead, and I like to work in my elevation view to start. All right. If you go to the Create tab, all right, you'll notice on the left here you have Forms. All right. And for those of you who are familiar with other 3D modeling softwares, all right, you're probably going to be familiar with all these different forms that you can create. So a solid extrusion, all right, blends, revolves, sweeps. All right. Now we're not going to get into the details of what exactly every single one is. All right, but you can see that you have a number of different ways that you can create shapes in your Revit model. All right, which means that the way that I create these shapes probably has a different method to create it. Right. So for instance, I'm going to create a frame. Right, that's going to kind of encompass the outside edge of our opening here. Okay. And what I like to do is I like to use an extrusion because it's kind of the simplest tool that we can use. All right, and I like to keep them as simple as possible. If you decide that you want to create it using a revolve or you want to create it using a sweep, all right, by all means you can do that. All right, it's completely up to you, whatever you feel comfortable with. All right, but like I said, I like to try and keep things as simple as possible, and so I'll basically be using an extrusion for everything that we create today. All right. So what I'm going to do is start out here in my exterior elevation view, all right, and I'm basically going to make a frame. Okay, and you can see here that we have the opening, as I mentioned, all right, already set and already locked in, all right, to a certain size. All right, we also have these green dashed lines, all right, which are reference planes. Now, I always recommend when you're building a family, all right, because it works a little bit easier, that whenever you're drawing any sort of geometries or you're drawing any sort of dimensions, is that you always use reference planes, all right, when you draw them in, and to use them, when you're building out your family, all right. And the reason for that is being that the families just work generally a little bit easier when you use these reference planes. Okay, so if you click on them, let's say for instance this one here, all right, you can see this reference plane highlights. If you go over into the properties for it, you can see that it actually has a name, so it's named as right. Okay, so we're looking at the exterior, so we're kind of looking at it reversed here. Right, so this is named right. Right, this reference plane is named left. Right, so the left side of the window. This is going to be our center for the left and right. All right, and the same is going to go for these. You got a top, you got a bottom. All right, or in this case, this one's named sill. All right, and now you don't need to name your different reference planes. All right, it's completely up to you. But if you are using, a whole number of different reference planes, and you're going to have a whole bunch of them sitting here. Sometimes it's a little bit easier, so that way if you're clicking on different things to check what they are, you remember what that reference plane's for, right? So if you have a bunch of different reference planes here, you click on this one, you can look at it and say, okay, that's supposed to be the right side of the window, right? And then as you add more reference planes, you can rename them whatever you want to be, so that way you can remember what each line is going to be doing. Okay. Now, essentially what I'm going to do here for my window frame, all right, is I'm going to want basically a rectangle that's going to go and fit inside this opening, all right, and also going to have an opening in the center left open, all right, so that we can put a sash and a window in. Okay, so if you think about it, we're kind of making a donut here, all right, but before we go and we create our actual geometry, right, is we're going to go and create reference planes so that we can lock pieces of geometry to it, all right, and kind of these reference planes and everything that you're creating here, all right, is more or less referred to as kind of the framework of your family, all right, or sometimes referred to as the skeleton, all right. So kind of the idea that if you have a a strong foundation, strong framework to your family, and a strong skeleton to the family, all right, everything's going to move the way that you want it to, okay, and it'll be kind of easier down the road if you need to make modifications to it. All right. So if I go to create and I go to reference plane, All right. So I'm going to go ahead and just draw, all right, is some reference planes for the inside edge of my frame. All right, so like I said, I'm going to basically draw and have a frame that kind of fills in my outside edge here. All right, and because we already have these reference planes here, all right, for the outside edge, all right, we're going to create reference planes for the inside edge. So I'm going to go ahead and start to place reference planes. All right, so you can see if I click, create that one reference plane. All right, and I'm going to create one on all four sides. All right, but what you'll also notice is when I place these, all right, I'm not being too picky as to how far away they are. All right, I'm just making sure that they're kind of inside my space. All right, so you can see that I have four now. All right, one top, one bottom, one left, one right. Okay. If you can imagine what we're going to do here with the geometry, right, is I'm going to basically fill in between the two reference planes, right, with what's going to be my window frame. Okay. So now I have my four kind of new reference planes. All right. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to constrain, all right, the thickness between here. All right. So we're going to, let's say we want to be able to tell Revit, right, when this window is in our project that, okay, I want my frame to be this thick, all right, ½ inch, quarter inch, whatever it may be. All right, and so that's what we're going to do now is we're going to set some dimensions to these lines, all right, and then we're going to actually constrain them and create a property for ourselves as well. Okay, and so once we have our four kind of reference planes, right, so I'm going to go to my dimension, right, and I'm just going to create kind of separate dimensions here, right, between the two lines on every side that we've created. Okay, now what's important is that when you draw these dimension lines, right, is that you make sure that you're actually selecting the reference planes as the ends of your dimension line. Right, so make sure it's the plane itself is highlighted. Okay, and so you can see I place one there and click. All right, so that's a separate piece. I'm going to want to do the same on this side here. Okay. All right, again, remembering don't bother with how thick they are right now because you'll see us change this in a minute. Okay, make sure you do one for the top as well. All right, again, making sure that you're selecting the reference plane, all right, and not the actual edge of your opening here, right? Because sometimes if you hover over, you might be selecting the edge of your opening and not the actual plane itself. All right, and kind of as a general rule, all right, when we're going and using reference planes, and we're going through the trouble of creating them, right, is you want to always draw dimension lines to reference planes as opposed to the edge of different pieces of geometry, all right? Just because Revit, once it starts changing the size and shape of things, it works just a little bit better with it when you do it with reference planes, all right? So now that we have four dimensions here, all right, we can see that they're all different sizes, okay? But what we're going to do is we're going to make a new parameter for ourselves, all right, and then we're going to constrain all these so that they fit that parameter. Okay, so what we're going to do is I have all these dimensions. Okay, is I'm going to go up to either the Modify tab or Create tab, right? Back under Properties here and do Family Types. Okay, again we see our size, 3x4 family type. Right, and on the right here you can see parameters. We're going to hit Add. Okay, so we're adding a parameter in. Now you notice under Parameter Type, it asks whether it's a family parameter, all right, or a shared parameter. Now, family parameter is basically what you're going to be creating 99% of the time. Shared parameter, depending whether or not you are using linked files or going to be using this family for a linked file or anything like that. Basically, you may want to do a shared parameter. Okay, but we won't get into kind of the intricacies of what the shared parameter is right now. But so we'll keep it as a family parameter. Okay, but basically a shared parameter is able to be shared between multiple families, multiple files, things like that. All right. Parameter name. Okay, so we're going to want to name it here. In this case, I'm going to say frame thickness. Okay. You can select here whether it's going to be a type property or an instance property. All right. So at this point, hopefully everyone understands the difference between the type and the instance property. All right. And so depending on what it is, all right, you may want it to be an instance property. Okay. In this case, because we want the frame thickness to kind of go along with every one of these family types, right? So every one of these family types is going to have the same frame thickness, right? And generally speaking, when you're talking about the dimension of the actual geometry itself, all right, you're almost always going to want to have a type property. Okay, so we're going to select type. Under discipline, right, whatever discipline that parameter may be falling under, right, in this case we'll keep this common. Okay, type of parameter. Now this is going to be an important field to fill out correctly. Right, now the type of parameter that you select is going to have an effect on how it adjusts and changes your model, all right, and how it adjusts and changes the size of the geometry itself. All right, so if you drop this down, you can see you have everything from text to integer, number, right, length, area, volume, all these different types of parameters. Okay, in this case, because it's going to be a dimension, all right, is we want to have it as length. All right, so that way Revit knows that we're going to assign it to a dimension value, all right, and it's going to be driven by a certain length. All right, and it's important to select the right parameter here, because a lot of times if you try and use this parameter, let's say we set it to area and tried to set it to a dimension, right, kind of a linear dimension, right, Revit's not going to go and be able to figure that out, and you'll get an error with it. All right, and it's also going to be important because once we start to try and calculate things like area and volume and things like that, all right, it's important that the parameters all match up with each other so that the units match up. So that, you know, to create an area, it's a length times a length, right, which ends up being the square, you know, of whatever value that is. Okay, and Revit needs to be able to calculate it correctly. So picking the correct type of parameter is important. All right. Now where it says group parameter under, this is less important. This is more or less visually where you want it to sort under in your family type here. All right, so here it says dimensions. I'm just going to leave it to dimensions, but you can see that you have a whole bunch of different headings that you can label and put it under. All right, so I'm just going to keep it under dimensions. All right, and this, which is kind of a new feature, right, tooltip description. We're not going to get into the actual tooltips and how you actually do these, right? Basically, they're just little tips that you can have as you're creating these and loading them into your families. All right. So once I have that filled out, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Okay, and you should see the frame thickness pop itself in under dimensions. Okay. Right now you see the value 0. All right, and you'll also notice right here under lock that it's unchecked. All right, as I'm going to check this box, and I recommend you do the same, right, for all of your different parameters that you put in. All right, and I'll show you what it does if it's unlocked. All right, it's not really a huge deal, but basically it just kind of helps and prevents you from accidentally dragging something and moving the size of it. Okay, so I like to keep those checked. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. All right, remember that we have that as frame thickness. Okay. And so now that we have a parameter created, right, for our frame thickness, all right, the next thing we do is once we have a parameter created, right, is we assign that parameter to a dimension. Okay, and so we have these 4 dimensions here. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign that value, all right, for frame thickness to these dimension lines. All right, so if I was to select this dimension right here, right, don't select the lines but the dimension itself, right, click it. If you look over either in the instance properties, all right, or just underneath the ribbon here where it says label, you can see it has none. If we drop this down, all right, as you can see that you have the option to set a label, all right, for any of the values that you have under your properties there. All right, so in this case I'm going to select frame thickness. Okay, you can see what it does. I drag it out of the way there, right? And now it goes and sets that frame thickness to that value of whatever this dimension was, right? And that's kind of just the default, right? Because we didn't type anything in for the frame thickness parameter, so it just inherited whatever value this was. So 3 3/16 inch, right? And inherited for the frame thickness. Okay, so if we go back now into family types, you can see here frame thickness, all right, is that 3-inch value. Okay, but let's say I want to change this now to, I don't know, 1/2 inch. Okay, so I've changed that now. Now if I hit apply, right, you should see that reference plane move, right, and that dimension line should change as well. So you can see here, okay, half inch, and I went and it moved that dimension line, all right, or that reference plane rather. Okay, and so that's the idea, is that you assign these labels to these dimensions, right, and it will move the reference planes accordingly, right? So you can kind of see the trend that we're going to do here is we're going to put this label on each one of these dimension lines, right? And so that way, that the frame thickness is going to determine how far away these reference planes are from the outside reference planes. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here for this dimension. Just want to select it, change the label to frame thickness, right? You should see that change. Do the same thing for this one here. All right, again, you should see these all change. Okay, so frame thickness, and you can click and drag these out of the way, right, just so they're a little bit easier to look at. Okay, but you should see something similar to this, right? You should be able to look and see and say, okay, all of my reference planes here, they're constrained with this frame thickness value. Okay, and they should all match because we've put the same value, all right, on each one of these dimensions. Right, now if for some reason you go through and you've done it and you change the value for it and it doesn't move, right, you'll know that something's incorrect in your family, right? Either the dimensions are going to the wrong reference planes, all right, or you're not constraining it correctly with the dimension line or something like that, right? So I would back up and kind of go through those steps again. Okay, and so we haven't actually modeled any sort of geometry yet, all right? All we've done is done these reference planes, all right, and constrained them with this frame thickness parameter that we created. All right. Now, again, it's important to kind of go and build out your framework of your family like this, all right, and check it and make sure everything works properly. That way, when you go and actually create geometry and you kind of lock the geometry into these reference planes, all right, is if you check yourself along the way, every single step that you do, right, you'll be able to find a problem much quicker and be able to solve it, right, than, much easier than going through your entire model. You've created an entire family, however intricate it may be, and then find out that there's a problem, and now you have to backtrack through however many steps to find where that issue is, right? So it kind of saves yourself a little time at the end to kind of put in a little more due diligence at the beginning to make sure that everything's going in correctly, okay? And so now that we have these dimension lines and we have the labels associated with them, right, we're going to go ahead and check and make sure that everything's moving the way that we want it to. Okay, so this process is kind of called flexing your model, right, or flexing the parameters, flexing the skeleton, whatever you may hear the term. Okay, but we're going to go through and we're going to flex this model now that we have these parameters associated with it. All right, essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to go and change the value of this half inch, right, for our frame thickness, and just make sure that when we change it, right, all of the lines move the way that we want them to. Okay, so if we go back up here and do our family types, okay, kind of move this window in a spot where you can see down below, all right, and we can see these move. Okay, right here, frame thickness where it says half inch, all right, change that value around. Okay, now I recommend doing a couple different dimensions for it, all right? A couple larger, a couple smaller, something like that, just to make sure that, no matter what the dimension is here, all right, is that these lines move accordingly, all right? So if I change this to 1 inch and hit apply, all right, as you should watch and see and say, okay, my value's changed, all right, and my line's moved, all right? Let's do this something like 5 inches, all right? Let's do something real drastic here. Okay, that's 5 feet. Sorry, we want 5 inches. Okay, now hit apply. Okay, and now you can see all of these lines move accordingly, right? These outside lines stay where they're supposed to, right, which is what we want. But the inside reference planes, they move according to that dimension there, all right? And you should see them all move at the same spacing, right? All change along with themselves. Okay, if we brought that back down to a half inch and apply, right, we should see them all move back as well. Okay, so it's important to do that, again, because if anything's messed up, whether the dimension's going to the wrong thing or the labels aren't correctly associated with your dimensions, all right, you'll be able to find out here when you're putting in different values and flexing your model, all right, before we get way down the road and realize that something isn't correctly associated with our reference planes. All right. So now that that's back, well, again, I'll keep that at 1/2 inch. All right, we can see here. All right, we now have our reference planes. All right, we flexed them. All right, we know that these move accordingly. All right, we know that the framework that we have so far is working correctly. All right, we have the parameters associated with them. Right, and so once we have our framework here, all right, the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to go ahead and create the actual geometry that goes in this spot, right? Because right now all we have is reference planes, so we don't have any actual geometry to go with it. Okay, so like I said, is I like to use the extrusion tool, right? You can build this however way you'd like to, right? But in my case, I'm going to do the extrusion tool. So I'm going to go to create. I'm going to go ahead and hit extrusion. All right. Now when we're in our sketch mode here, all right, we're going to draw this, if you think of it similar to the way that we're going to draw a floor with a hole in it, all right, is we're going to want to draw an outline for the outside edge of our frame, and then we're going to draw a line for the inside edge of our frame. Okay, but you'll notice when I draw it here is I'm just going to draw a big rectangle. I'm not going to trace directly on top of where I want it. All right, you can, but I'll show you why in a second, why I don't like to do that. All right, so I'm going to say, okay, this is going to be my outside edge. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of arbitrarily draw that. All right, so the pink line here is going to represent the outside edge. All right, we know that the outside edge of our frame, we're going to want to line up with the outside reference planes for each side. Right, so for the top, the bottom there, and the left and the right. Okay, but the reason why I like to draw it kind of larger like this, right, is once I have it drawn, okay, is I'm going to use the align tool, all right, and I'm going to align them to the reference planes that I want them to be. Okay, so if I'm going to select this top one here, again, you want to select the topmost reference plane, right, for this line here. So if you select the reference plane first, okay, then select this sketch line, right, it aligns itself to it. All right, and right after you align it, is you'll notice that you get this little lock key, right, and so once you align it, click on that lock, right, and what the lock value does is now that you've aligned it, is that's saying you want to lock that alignment on that reference plane, all right, and that's important because that means wherever this reference plane moves, the sketch line is going to move with it, right, so that outside edge is always going to move, all right, along with that reference plane. So no matter what the height changes, all right, if you change this to 5, right, that sketch line is going to go and move up with it as well, right. So using that same idea is, if you can imagine, we're going to go and lock all of our sketch lines in place to these reference planes. All right, so that way, no matter where these reference planes move, all right, the geometry is always going to change shape and follow it. Okay, so using that same method that I did on the top there, I'm going to go around the whole thing. All right, is the far right reference plane. All right, I'm going to do that, lock it in place. All right, do it on the bottom here. All right, again, making sure that you're aligning to the reference plane, right, and not the edge of the actual opening itself, right, because again, much like the dimensions, we want to make sure that we're locking and aligning the edges of our geometry, right, to actual reference planes as opposed to the edges of other pieces of geometry themselves, all right. So we'll do it on the bottom, align that, lock it in place, all right, and do it for the left side as well, lock it in place. Alright, now I should have all 4 of them here. If I select the modify arrow and select one of these lines, alright, it should highlight and you should see that a lock symbol on all 4 of these lines here. Alright, and that's what we want. Alright, so again, we're making sure that all 4 of those are locked. Okay, now if I click the check mark now, right, this is basically going to just build a big square right here, solid rectangle, okay, which is not what we want. We want to be able to have a hole in the middle of it. Okay, but for right now, all right, we have this large rectangle. Okay, and the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to now want to draw the inside edge of our frame. Okay, so basically, like I said, is if you think of this kind of the same way that we did our floors, and we drew a hole in our floor, we just kind of drew another outline, and that was the hole. All right, we're going to do the same thing here. All right, use the same kind of logic behind it. So now if I draw another sketch, all right, again keeping it off and kind of arbitrarily drawing it here, right? That way I can align and lock things in place. All right, this is going to be the inside edge. So I'm going to do the same thing and do a line, but now instead of aligning it to the outside reference plane, I'm going to align it to the inside edge. All right, so the inside reference plane, click on that line, lock it in place. All right, again, make sure that you lock it in place. That's the most important part of this. All right, lock it in place. All right, make sure that you're locking it to the reference plane. All right, not the geometry. All right, lock it in place. Okay. So now once you get all four, if you select it, all right, you should see 2 locks on either side. All right, so a total of 8 different locks, and they should all be locked, because that means all of these sketch lines are locked onto your reference planes. Okay? And now with that being said, is once you have all of these outlines in, right, they're all locked in place, I'll go ahead and hit the check mark. Okay? And so that's kind of what we have there. Alright, so now that's gone and created a geometry for us, right, which you can see extrusion you could select. Alright, if we went back into edit. Alright, so you can see that we have that extrusion there now. Now when you're in the actual edit mode, you can go ahead in the properties of it and you can change the material for it. Okay, completely up to you. I'm just going to leave it kind of as default or by category for now, because we're not really going to play with the materials for right this minute. Okay, it's not important for what we're doing. Alright, but now that we've created this geometry, alright, and these are locked in place, is we're going to want to flex the model again, just to make sure that the geometry is locked correctly to these reference planes. Right? We know that the reference planes move correctly. We want to make sure that the geometry does as well. Alright, so if we go into family types, over here again, alright, change any of these values. So if I did 3 inches for this, apply. Alright, make sure that you watch and not only do the reference planes move, but the edge of that frame moves as well. Alright, again, do a couple different measurements for yourself. Alright, make sure that everything moves and changes and flexes correctly. Alright, that's important. Alright, so there you go. Alright, so you can see that all these move. We change the dimensions around. 1/4 inch. Alright, and you can put it back to the 1/2 inch or whatever it is you had it at originally. Okay, and change it back. But again, we just want to check and make sure that whenever we change one of these values, right, and even change the height too, just to make sure that everything moves correctly. Right, so you can see the height of the window changes. Alright, but everything kind of moves the same way as well. Okay. Want to make sure that everything goes and moves smoothly. Alright, because again, if you go and you change one of these values and you notice that one of these edges stays where it is, everything else moves, but one of the edges stays where it is, alright, you know that that's not properly locked in place. Alright, and you're going to want to go back and relock it. So if, for instance, you know, we move this and this bottom edge here didn't move along with the reference plane, right? Everything else moved, but the reference plane, but the edge of the extrusion didn't move with it. Alright, if you select the extrusion and go back into edit extrusion, right, you can move it simply by alright, dragging that line off of where it is, alright, and then using that align tool and just realigning it. Okay, making sure that it's locked. Okay, so that's the most important part, is making sure that that sketch line is locked onto one of your reference planes. Okay, so again, make sure you go through, you flex it, everything looks fine for yourself. Okay, so that way you know that when you change that value for the frame thickness or the width or the height, right, that this frame is going to move along with it. Okay, and so in elevation view, alright, in terms of the frame, we're all set. Okay, we know that this moves fine, everything moves when I change my values around. Alright, so in terms of the elevation when we're looking at it, we're all set with our frame. Right, but what we need to do is, if you look at your floor plan now, right, you'll notice that you have this extrusion that's sticking way out back here. Alright, and that's because we just did the extrusion in the elevation, alright, and we didn't set the depth of it or anything like that. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set this and constrain this in plan view as well, right? Now with the frame, it's a little bit different, okay, because if you think of the frame of your window is, we're going to constrain it a little bit differently than we're going to for other pieces of the window, right? But let's say the frame, right, with a wall, okay, is the frame, we're always going to want the front edge to line up with the edge of our wall, right, and the back edge to line up with the back edge of the wall. Okay, so what we can do for this is it helps that we have these little arrows to drag, right? But if we drag until it lines up with the front edge of the wall here, right, and let it go, you'll notice that you have a lock key, right? And I'm going to lock that in place, right? This is one of the few exceptions where I say you want to use the edge of the geometry to lock it into place. All right, we're going to do the same with the back edge. Just drag it until it meets up with the back edge there, right, and then lock it into place. Okay. Now what this does is, in the elevation view we saw when we changed the parameters around, right, it changed all the thicknesses of the side and everything like that, right? But in plan view now, by dragging each one of these edges and locking it into place, and aligning it with the faces of the wall, all right, what that's going to do is when you bring this into a project, right, is, this wall here in particular, it happens to be a 6-inch thick wall, all right, kind of a generic one. Okay, but when you load this into a project, chances are, your wall might not be exactly 6 inches thick. It might be 6.5, might be 7, might be a foot thick, anything like that, all right? Well, what I've done is I've constrained this window frame so that the front edge and the back edge are always going to meet up with the outside faces of the wall. So no matter how thick or thin this wall gets, all right, this frame is always going to adjust to that size. All right, so if I was to go and change the thickness of this wall, right, so if I selected the wall, came into type, all right, the same way you would change the structure or thickness of any other wall, right, and I changed this to 4 inches instead, and hit OK, all right, go all the way through here and hit apply, right, you see the wall changes and you see the front edges of that frame move along with it as well, all right? So again, as I'm basically just constraining it to those front edges, so that way, no matter how thick this wall gets, all right, or how thin it gets, this window frame is always going to adjust. All right, and so again, that's how I decided to build this window. In this window frame, you don't need to have it like that. All right, you can actually go and create dimensions and actually keep it off from the edge. All right, completely up to you. All right, but for this case, because we're keeping it as simple as possible, all right, is that's what I've decided to do with it. All right. Okay. So now that we've constrained that frame in the plan view, right, just open up your 3D view real quick and take a look at it. Right, so you should see, and now instead of just an opening, all right, is you have this little frame or an extrusion here. All right, and then you have something sitting here in the middle. Now you should be able to look and see straight through. All right, is you should notice that there is an actual opening here still. All right, if for some reason you do have a solid piece here, right, go back and check your extrusion, right? A lot of times what people will do is when they're in the elevation view, right, with this extrusion, all right, a lot of people will draw this outside edge and then hit the check mark and then draw the inside edge as a completely separate extrusion, all right? But so what that does is just basically makes two solid extrusions from itself, all right, which is not what you want to do. Is you want to make this all as one single extrusion, all right, and draw both the outside edge and the inside edge all in one kind of sketch, all right, so that way it goes and it fills the solid in between the two different sketch lines, right, leaves the middle here open. Okay. All right. And so now that we have the frame, all right, kind of settled out here, all right, we're going to go ahead and create the next piece of our window, which is going to be the sash. All right, and so the sash, if you think of it, is kind of the larger piece that holds the glass, all right, directly. Right, usually if it's a double hung window, it's the piece that slides up and down. All right, but we're just going to kind of do a simple fixed window. All right, that's just going to have a single size sash. Okay, and we're going to create it very similar to the same way that we did our window frame here. All right, so we're going to want to make reference planes, all right, for the edge of our window sash. All right, but in the same way that we only did the inside, made reference plane for the inside edge of our window frame, right, we're only going to want to do the inside edges for our window sash as well, because the outside edge, all right, is going to live and going to want to align directly with the inside edge of our frame, right? And we already have that reference plane for it, right? So we're only going to have to create 4 more reference planes, right, for the inside edge. So we're going to do the same process, all right? As I'm back in my exterior elevation, right? And under create, I'm going to go to reference plane, right? I'm going to do the same thing as before. All right, create 4 new reference planes here. Alright, so again, top, bottom, left, and right. Okay, not paying attention to what I have for the distances between them. Alright, and then I'm going to go and draw dimension lines now between this middle one, right, because it's going to be the inside edge of this frame. Alright, and now to this new reference plane that we created. Alright, because we want to do the dimension between the 2 of these, right, to set the thickness of our window sash. Alright, so you can see that I'm now drawing another dimension here. Okay, again, making sure that you're drawing the dimension between the 2 reference planes, alright, not the edge of the geometry itself. Okay, it's important to make sure that you're selecting the reference planes again, because once Revit comes through here and starts to move things around, alright, you want to make sure that it's referencing the planes and not the geometry. Okay. And yes, as you start to draw these in, you're going to get a bunch of dimensions that kind of overlap each other, right? That's normal. You can drag them, all right, so that way you can read them a little bit better. Okay. What we're going to do for this one, okay, instead of making a parameter that's going to change it, all right, so let's say the sash for this window family is, you know what, this window sash is always going to be, 1.5 inches thick, right? This dimension, I always want to be 1.5 inches thick. I don't care what size the window is, this sash is always going to be 1.5 inches thick. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go and change this dimension to 1.5 inches, and we're going to lock that dimension in place, right? And we're going to do it, and we're not going to have to create a new parameter for it, because we're not going to want to have to change it. All right, so the only time you're going to want to create a parameter is if you're going to want it to be a value that you're going to have the ability to change inside the project. If it's a dimension like this that we're talking about, where we're saying, okay, this is going to be 1.5 inches, but we don't want to have to change it, all right? We don't want to have the ability to change it, is you don't have to create a parameter and then assign a label to it, all right? Is you can go and move these lines and adjust this value, right? The same way you would when we were building walls or anything like that, okay? So if you click this inside edge here, all right, and then click on the dimension value and say, okay, you know what, let's make it instead 2.5. So we'll say 2.5 inches, all right, hit enter. Okay, so now that's 2.5 inches there, right, between these 2 lines, which is great. That's what we want the value to be, all right? And once we move that and adjusted that dimension value, if you select your dimension now, right, you'll notice that you have the little lock mark, similar to the way that we did when we aligned. If we lock that dimension, right, that means now this dimension between these 2 lines here is always going to sit at 2.5 inches, right? And that's what we want. So we're going to do the same for all 4 of these dimensions, all right? So select that inside line, all right, because that's the line that we want to move, all right, to kind of refresh your guys' memory. If you're moving lines depending on dimensions like this, you always select the object that's going to move. Okay, so it's there. Again, we'll say 2.5. All right, so that's now 2.5. Select that dimension, lock it. All right, do the same here. At the bottom line, 2.5 inches. Okay. Select that dimension line, lock it in place. All right, and do the same down here on the bottom. Select the line, 2.5 inches. Okay. And we're going to want to select the dimension and lock it in place. Okay. So now, as you select each one of these new dimensions that we placed, all right, each one of them should have that lock symbol, and it should be locked. Okay. So now that we have them locked in place, let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did before and flex your model. All right. So now what we're looking for is these inside edges. All right, the kind of lines in the middle here, those will move around. So if we change that thickness here, we change that to 3 inches. All right, we should see that those inside edges move, right? But these dimensions that we just locked in place, those don't change, right? Which is the way that we want it to be. Okay, so we go, move it around, all right, try a couple different values, all right, and just make sure that all of these are moving the way that you're intending them to, right? Again, those inside lines are always staying the 2.5 inches away from the middle ones, all right? And again, that's how, I've decided that this family is going to be, right? Now, you don't have to have them all the same like this. If you decide that you want to change it up a little bit, right, and this bottom one's going to be a little larger, or these sides are going to be a little smaller, something like that, all right? Completely up to you and how you want to do it, all right? But the same methods that we're using here, either creating a parameter and selecting a label for each one of these dimension lines, or we're doing a dimension and locking it, all right? Both of those methods can be used to kind of constrain your model, okay? So frame thickness, if I change this back to, I think I had a 1/2 inch, okay, all right, everything moves back into place, all right? These dimensions are locked, okay? And now we have these dimensions, right, and we have these reference planes, the new ones, right, locked in place, and we know that these dimensions all work, right? So we flex the model again, all right? And now that these are all set in place, all right, is we're going to go through and we're going to do the same thing that we did for the frame here, all right? So I'm going to create another extrusion, all right? Again, you can select the material for it, all right? You've probably noticed the extrusion end and extrusion start. All right, this basically tells Revit how, in plan view, how large this is, all right? So where it starts and where it stops, all right? The reference plane, all right, or the work plane that it's selecting is that center line, if you looked at it in a plan view. All right, basically it's already automatically selecting the center line as your work plane, so that's kind of your drawing surface, if you will, all right? So it starts there and goes back a foot, so it extends itself back a foot, okay? You can change that if you want here ahead of time. I usually just leave it because I come back anyways and readjust it. All right, but I'm going to do the same thing here that we did for the outside frame. All right, so I'm going to go kind of arbitrarily draw my outside edge. All right, and then I'm going to use the align tool. And now the outside edge of my window sash, all right, is now it's not going to be the farthest most outside edge. All right, but I want it to match up with the inside edge of our frame. Okay. But again, instead of aligning with the geometry, all right, is I want to make sure I select that reference plane, all right, so select that middle one and align it, all right, make sure I lock it in place, okay, and then do the same going all the way around, lock it into place, all right, get down to the bottom here, lock it, okay. So again, very important to make sure that you're selecting the reference plane, right, not the edge of the geometry, and then you lock it into place afterwards. All right, so we select it, you should see 4 locks there. All right, then we're going to do the same as well for an inside edge. All right, so now going to align to the inside edges, right, these inside reference planes. Lock, lock, right, so it's going to look very similar. And there we go. Okay, so now when we go and hit the check mark, right, you should see that it goes and it changes. We now have an extrusion here as well. All right, make sure that you go through and flex the model. Okay, again, change the values around. All right, that way you know that it all moves. Okay, you can see, all right, change in there. The frame thickness changed, the distance between those does not, alright, which is what we want it to be doing. Alright, again, just try a couple different thicknesses and a couple different values. That way you know that it's moving correctly the way that you want it to. Alright, and then I'm just going to change it back to normal, the way I want it. Okay? So make sure you go through and flex that. Alright. Now we're going to have to do the same thing here, as if you go back into your plan view, right, you should see now your geometry for the window sash is similar to the way that the frame looked, okay? But what we're going to do is instead now of saying we want it to line up with the front edge and back edge of our wall, right? Is we want to kind of create a different set of rules for this window sash, right? So that way it stays centered on our wall, let's say. Okay. So one of the first things I'm going to do is, before I draw this out here, is you saw I dragged this front edge off, right? So it's kind of off into space here, right? Give myself a little bit more clear of a view of what that edge is. Okay. And with that extrusion selected, right, is I'm going to click on this little button in the middle here, which is, you'll see if you hover over it, disassociate the work plane. All right. And what this does is it basically tells Revit that this extrusion now is kind of freely in space, right? So originally when we drew it, right, it associated itself with the front edge or this center line of our wall in the plan view. All right. And what that does by me disassociating it, all right, is kind of saying that this kind of is now kind of a freestanding object, right? So I can freely move this and adjust it and constrain it, all right, without having to worry about where its reference plane is, okay? And it makes it just a little bit easier to constrain things, okay? Now, I don't recommend doing it for every single one of your objects, all right? But if you're going to do kind of some heavy constraining with it, like we're going to do with this here, right, is I would recommend you disassociate the work plane, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a couple different dimensions here. So one of the first dimensions I'm going to draw an overall dimension for it, right? So the overall thickness. So if I draw a dimension here from the front edge of the extrusion, or the back edge of the extrusion to the front edge, right? I'm going to go ahead and just kind of place it out here. Alright, so now we have an overall thickness of it. Okay. But what I'm going to do next as well is I'm going to do a set of dimension lines here so that we can say we want this centered on our wall at all times. Alright, so for instance, if we select the back edge here, alright, we bring it to the center line of our wall, alright, you should see that it highlights the center line, alright, but take note as to what it's actually highlighting. Alright, so if we hover it over the center line there, and we look in the bottom left corner here of our screen, is right now it says walls, basic wall, generic 6-inch reference, okay? And so we know that it's selecting the center line of our wall, okay? Now you can do that, but the problem is depending on your makeup of the wall, all right, the makeup might, depending on what's in the core, what's on your finishes and so on, all right, is the center line of your wall may shift, all right, depending on how thick it is and what's in the core of your wall and what's not. Right, so I don't want to constrain it to the center line of the wall necessarily, right, but I want to constrain it to the reference plane that we have here, okay, that you can see with that green dashed line. Alright, so when we hover over the center here, if we use the tab key, alright, you guys should be familiar with using the tab key by now and cycle through. Alright, if you hit tab once, you can see that it highlights now the reference plane, alright, instead of the center line of the wall. Right, again, checking back down in that bottom left corner, you can see that it's highlighting the reference plane. And that's what we want to select when we go and click the next leg of this dimension line. Alright? And so before we place this, right, so now I have a dimension from the back edge to that center line, right? And before I end the string, as I want to go and click now the front edge of this extrusion, like this, alright? So now you can see with the string here from the back edge to the center line, right, that center reference plane, to the front edge, right, and I'm going to click out here and place it, alright. Now you can see, you know, our values kind of jump on top of each other, alright. You can go and try and move the values around here if you feel like it. Okay. So now that we have these constrained, if you remember when we were doing our windows and doors, alright, is you're able to draw a string of dimensions like this, and then you're able to select this EQ button, and what it does is evenly spaces it out. Alright, so we're going to do the same thing. Is if you select the EQ, alright, you can see that it now goes and constrains itself so that, let me just drag these out here so we can read it a little bit better. Alright, is that now it's gone and moved both edges, alright, the front and back, so that it's now equaled with that center line, right? And that's important because, again, like I said, is we want this to be constrained, so no matter where the center line is here, that this always stays equal on both sides and centers itself. Okay? And we can leave it as the EQ like that. Right? But what we can also do now is if we select our extrusion itself, alright, we can then select this dimension that's the overall, alright, and we can say, okay, this is going to be 2 inches. Alright, so it's 2 inches thick. Alright, and that changes that. Okay, but we know that it's also going to be centered because we have this constraint here as well. Okay, now in this case I'm going to lock this down. Alright, so that thickness is always going to be 2 inches. Alright, and again, basically what we just did is we remembered disassociate that from its work plane. Alright, we did an overall dimension, right, so that way we can change the thickness of that. And then what we also did is we did a string of dimensions, right, from the back edge of this extrusion to this center reference line, right, so again, make sure that you select the reference line, or reference plane, and then in that same string we selected the front edge, alright, and then we just selected that EQ button, alright, and that will go and create it so that each one of these edges is going to be centered. Okay, so again, depending on the thickness of the wall, whatever, this sash is always going to sit and center itself in that spot. Okay, now if you check on it in 3D, right, you should see something like this. Right, if you rotate yourself around, so you should have that frame, right, you have that sash there. Okay, and you still have that opening in the center, alright, which is where we're going to put the glass here in a minute. Alright. Okay. And so hopefully you got to this point where we have both the sash and the frame, alright, and hopefully as you go and change these parameters around, everything stretches and flexes correctly. Okay. If not, try and double back and find out where you're having the issues. Alright, whether it's the geometry that's not constrained properly or if it's the reference planes. Alright, kind of double yourself through, and again, each one of these steps and each iteration you go, whether it's placing the reference planes and then flexing the model, right, and then creating the geometry and then flexing the model, right, it's always important that you flex it every single time, so that way you're able to find if there is an issue, alright, before you get all the way to this point, alright, or before you get all the way and create a whole window, alright, and you'll be able to find where that issue is. Alright, so my last bit right here that we're going to want to do is we're just going to want to put the glass, right, for this window in here. Alright, and I'm going to do this the same exact way, alright, with the extrusion again because it's kind of the simplest way to do it. Alright, but in this case, because we want the wall to kind of be a solid piece and we don't need to have a hole in it, alright, is we don't have to make any additional reference planes. Right, we just want it to go and match up with the inside edge of our windowsill, right, or our window sash rather. Alright, so back in my exterior elevation, if I go ahead to create an extrusion, alright, I'm going to do a similar task here, alright, do my overall rectangle, and then align them, right. Now again, not to the edge of the geometry, make sure that I select the most inside reference plane, right, align that, lock it into place, right, and do the same all the way around for all 4 of these. Lock it into place. Okay. And because this is glass as well, alright, is this one, I'm going to go ahead and change my material. Alright, category. Alright, and you should have a glass that's already made here by default. Alright, so I'm going to select glass. Okay. Alright, and again, I'm only selecting glass for this one because that way the material knows and it'll be transparent when we actually view it. Okay. Just double check myself, make sure everything is locked in place. Alright, hit the check mark. Okay. Go ahead, go through the process here, flex this, right, whether it's the frame thickness, whatever. Alright, change this around and make sure that everything moves and flexes correctly. Okay. Alright. And once it's flexed here in the elevation view, just go to your floor plan view. Okay. You can see this. Alright, and you can go through the same process here, and you can constrain it the same way that we constrained our sash. Okay, so I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to select it, disassociate the work plane. Okay, do a couple different dimensions. One is going to be the back line. And make sure we select that reference plane, front line. Okay, place that there. The EQ, right? And do an overall dimension. Okay, so select it. And something like a 1/4 inch, right? So there we go with that. And we'll lock that one down as well. Okay, so now we have that piece of glass, right? Again, constrained, very similar to the way that the sash is. So that's always going to sit in the space, all right, between this whole wall. All right. Get in 3D. Right, so you should see something similar to this. Right, you have your frame, you have your sash. Right, you should have that little thickness for your glass window there. Right, and while you're in your 3D view, if you're already still in the hidden lines like I am, if you change your visual style in the bottom here to something like shaded, right, you should be able to see through that pane of glass. Okay, there's their thickness there for the glass. Seeing right through, seeing the other end of the sash. Right. Okay. And if you want to go and run through one more round of flexing the model, alright, while you're in 3D here, alright, that can be useful as well, just to make sure that in 3D everything looks fine as well. Alright, changing that around, frame thickness. Right. Doing something from the width, making sure that all changes as well. Right. Again, making sure that when you're flexing it, you're changing kind of all your parameters, just making sure that everything moves the way that you want it to. Okay. Alright. And so that kind of concludes our basic window model. Alright, so this is our basic window family. Alright, again, we kind of have the single 3x4. Alright. We've made a frame. Okay, we've made a sash, and we've also made a pane of glass. Alright, and we've kind of constrained them in 3 different ways. Right, if you remember, we made the first, our window frame is constrained by using, right, a label and by creating a parameter for ourselves. Right, and then both the sash and the frame, or the sash and the pane of glass itself, right, are constrained more with dimensions. And if we look at it in the plan views as well, right, they're constrained differently with the dimensions as well, right? And so any combination of these methods, right, to constrain your geometries and reference planes to each other, right, is really completely up to you on how you want to be able to constrain the model and constrain the family itself, and kind of down the road be able to adjust it, right? So each one of these where I went and just did a dimension and locked it in place, right, instead of making a parameter, you could in turn go and create a new parameter for it. So, you know, sash thickness or, you know, glass thickness, right? You can create a parameter for it and then assign the label to this dimension line, right? And do the same way. So that way when you load this family into a project, right, you have that option. You can change around the thickness of the glass and the sash and everything else, all right? So it's not just limited to the way that we did it here where, you know, everything for the sash and the pane of glass is locked with just a dimension itself. Alright, so you can change those and make those adjustable as well. Alright, again, it just comes down to how detailed you want to get and how much customization you want to be able to do after you load this into a project. Okay. And so with this kind of saved, alright, or this kind of finished, alright, so again, make sure that you flex everything moves fine. So I'm just going to kind of go up to File and do Save. Alright. Save this wherever you need to. Alright, I'm just going to name this window family. window family 1. Okay. Save. Alright. And now with that saved on, in my case, the desktop, alright, wherever it is saved for you, okay, you can now go in, and when you open up a new project, you can insert this, alright, and load it into your projects and use it the same way you would with any other window family. Alright, so if I close out all of these, alright, so I'm back out to the main screen here, and I just open up a new project for myself. Alright, architectural template. Alright, so I'm kind of in a blank project now. Alright, I'm going to draw myself a wall. Okay. Alright, doesn't matter what thickness it is, doesn't matter what the materials are. Okay. But I'm going to go ahead and load my window family in. So either go to Window, alright, and go to Load Family, or you can go to Insert and Load Family. Go to Load Family, alright, navigate to wherever it is you have your file saved. Okay, in this case it's that there. Load the family in. Alright, so now you can see in your type selector, there we go, we have window family 1 and we have that one type. Alright, the 3x4. And we can go ahead and we can place it, and it pops up right there, right, in our project, and be placed in our wall. Alright, now just like any of your other window families, if you go into Edit Type, right, you can see that there's our frame thickness that we created, right, that you can adjust that, your height and your width, right, and if you decided to go through and create any other parameters, right, you'll find them in here as well. Okay. In the same way that we duplicate the types, right, you can still duplicate the types here before you go and change any of the values here. Alright, so if I want 6 feet instead, alright, and again, you can adjust those the same way that you do. Alright, look at that in 3D, alright, so you can see our windows there. Alright, that we have created. Now what's nice is, as I was saying, with that frame, right, is this is just a generic 8-inch wall. If we change the wall type to something, alright, one of these exterior wall types, so a little bit thicker, right, you can see that that goes and that frame stretches, right, so that it actually meets the front and the back edge, right, of that wall. Alright, again, that's because we constrained those to that front and back edge of the wall when we created the family. Alright, but that sash and window, right, always stay centered right there in the middle. Right, so it's kind of cool to load that in afterwards and bring that family in and use it. Alright, kind of nice to be able to see, you know, something that you created and how it actually affects, alright, itself in the in an actual project. Okay. And so that's kind of, you know, it for your basic family, right? So like I said, is, you know, this was creating a very basic window family, right? We only did 3 kind of elements. You know, if you wanted to, when we were creating the family, is you can create, you know, pieces of trim that kind of sit on the outside of the wall, right? You can definitely create more detailed, you know, frames and sashes and windows, right? You know, constrain them a little bit differently if you didn't want to, you know, have them directly centered, right? Instead of making a dimension that has it centered from the front of the wall, all right, or the center of the wall, you can actually offset it, you know, so it's sitting itself a couple inches off the front edge, anything like that, all right? But the same idea that we used with drawing the dimensions, locking the dimensions in place, or creating, you know, a parameter value for it and assigning it to that dimension, right? That's the same process you're going to want to use going forward with any of your families, right? Whether it's a window, whether it's a door, whether it's a piece of furniture, anything like that, all right? Also, you know, aside from just creating a family from scratch, right, is you should be able to go in and open up an existing family that you have, whether it's a window or a door, all right? And you should be able to, you know, modify it a little bit, right? And you should be able to see that, okay, these are the parameters someone has already created, all right? How can I modify these a little bit so that they're, you know, what I want? Maybe you need to add a couple more parameters, okay? So, before you go and create something completely from scratch, right, is I would recommend going and trying to find either a window or door family or whatever it is that's similar to what you're trying to do, right? Because a lot of times is if you find something similar, it's a lot easier to just modify that than it might be to create it completely from scratch, right? But as always with, any kind of file type that you're doing is if you're going to modify a family, right, make sure you do a save as and you don't just save over the original file. That way you always still have that original file to go back to. Alright. Alright, and so now that we've kind of gone through families, right, and again, this is very basic, so if you want to dig into more with families, feel free to, and if you start to come up with questions or problems that may arise, please ask questions about it. Shoot me an email. Okay. Because families are very complex, and they can be very complex. All right. There's a reason why, there's positions within larger firms, and there's, entire books that, focus directly just on families themselves, is because you can make them, very complex and in depth, if you feel like it. Okay. But the last thing that we want to go over here is now that we've kind of talked about, loadable families and things like that, is go over schedules.